I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mack Payne.
This is Mack Payne here with episode 1721 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran, along with none other than that notable history professor up there at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Dr. Bob Rodrigues. This episode will be part 2 of his presentation about the counterculture that occurred during the Vietnam days. He's going to be highlighting one big event that occurred during those days that was known as Woodstock. Woodstock was one of those things that everyone, especially Vietnam veterans, can remember where they were when that went on. In August of 1969, when it was going on, I just happened to be in seventh heaven. I was out at Fort Walters, Texas, learning how to fly helicopters in a TH-55 trainer helicopter. It was a small little two-seater run by rubber bands, and I loved every minute of it. It was a great experience. We learned how to go out in the vicinity of Possum Kingdom Lake and pick up those white tires that the instructors had placed out in the woods out there with the skid on that little helicopter and move them over to a different location. Sometimes at one of those little country places that sold refreshments, because as students, we were not allowed to land anywhere except on one of those white tires they had strewn out in the countryside around Possum Kingdom Lake. That's what I was doing in August of 1969 when Woodstock was going on. And you know what? I could care less about what was going on over in New York State because I was just loving it, flying those little helicopters, getting ready to head back over to Vietnam and fly Cobra gunships and engage in rocking and socking the bad guys with 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets. That's what I was doing when Woodstock was going on, getting ready for the big show as a Cobra gunship pilot. Dr. Bob is going to go over Woodstock in detail. Going to tell you all about it. Matter of fact, he's going to have a guest presenter by the name of Rebecca Brady that's going to tell us all about it. No doubt you're going to enjoy it. Again, I would like to ask that you get rid of all the distractions in your vicinity, both mechanical and human, so you can take in everything Dr. Bob has to say about the counterculture and the Woodstock music event. Without any further ado, Dr. Bob, you got it. Go for it.
Now, one of the major symbols of the counterculture movement occurred in August of 1969 in Bethel, New York, and what we know as Woodstock. Okay, now I'm going to play a short description of those 3 days that occurred at Woodstock in August of 1969.
This was arguably the most important concert in the history of music. Hi, I'm Rebecca Brayton, and welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the 3 days of music and peace that were Woodstock. There are many events emblematic of hippies and the counterculture of the 1960s. One of the most important and well-known was the Woodstock Music and Arts Fair. At the time of the event, the United States was steeped in racial discord and military conflict overseas. Woodstock was not simply a music and arts festival, it morphed into a counterculture microcosm. At the outset, hippie rock promoters Michael Lang's and Artie Kornfeld's vision was for an isolated recording studio planted in the middle of a forest. John Roberts and Joel Rosenman were instrumental in the evolution of the idea from studio to outdoor concerts, but were also the money men behind the event. Since Woodstock cost well over $2 million to put on, these venture capitalists were important. The event was held on a 600-acre dairy farm owned by Max Yasgur in Bethel, New York, from August 15th to the 18th, 1969. The land was a perfect natural venue. The stage was set at the bottom of a hill, allowing viewers sitting far away to at least catch a glimpse of the performers. At the bottom of the slope was a pond, which became a popular place for skinny dipping. While the event was opposed by local townspeople from the get-go, eventually legal problems were solved and planning went ahead. Engineering a sound system for the event was another huge hurdle. Finally, a solution was set in place for a potential crowd of 150 to 200,000. Little did the organizers know actual attendance numbers would more than double their estimates. Massive crowds descended on rural New York the day of the festival, causing huge traffic jams. Even some of the acts scheduled to play the festival were caught up in the traffic and ended up being unable to play. Originally, Woodstock was not meant to be a free event. 186,000 tickets were sold beforehand, and organizers only anticipated about 200,000 people would show up in total. When it became apparent that they were way off in their estimation, the fence surrounding the event was ceremonially cut down. This step helped solidify the event's vibe of peace, love, and inclusiveness, and also caused a lot more concertgoers to show up. In total, about 500,000 people were in attendance at Woodstock. Meanwhile, mainstream media wanted to report the worst about the festival. The event took place on an extremely hot weekend. Torrential rain transformed the event site into a giant mud puddle. Drug use was rampant, and the presence of unsanitary conditions and food shortages were all angles they wanted to play up. Ironic. Many sources today cite the amount of drugs consumed at the event as the reason for a lack of violence. And considering the massive amount of people in attendance at the three-day event, there were remarkably few serious problems. No violent crime was reported, and few deaths took place, all of which were accidental. However, on a happier note, Woodstock is also said to be the setting for 2 births. And then there was the music. Despite the 4 promoters' relative inexperience, they were able to book some of the most important acts of the day. 32 musicians and groups played at the event, including legendary performances by The Who, Janis Joplin, Joe Cocker, and Jimi Hendrix, to name only a few. This took a great amount of money, and the promoters were virtually bankrupted by the event. However, they retained the movie rights, and the 1970 documentary Woodstock more than made their money back. The Woodstock Music and Arts Fair is considered by many a symbol of the age of innocence, when young citizens from all walks of life and varying political associations got together and simply enjoyed music. It has gone down in the annals of rock and is arguably a turning point in the 20th century. There is some debate as to its place in history books, but some will simply remember it as the party of a lifetime.
So that is a rendition of Woodstock. I want to just reiterate something. There were 2 deaths during those 3 days. One was an overdose, and the other was a young man who was in his sleeping bag, really kind of in the mud, and a car backed over onto him and crushed him. But again, on a positive note, there were 2 babies born. So the same amount of people who went into Woodstock came out of Woodstock. So again, I think you heard that there were probably about 500,000 there. It was very hard to take account. The police did not enforce drug laws. The Woodstock took place over actually 4 days when you include Monday, but it was Friday, the 15th of 1969, and they had a list of musicians who were there on that day, and then Saturday, August 16th, and then Sunday, August 17th. By then, most of the crowd had pretty much gone away. By Monday, there were only 3 musicians and bands that were scheduled. One was Jimi Hendrix, the one was Sha Na Na, the other was Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and there were probably less than 100,000 there by then. They were all trickling out because the weekend had been long. They had, as I said, food shortages and mud and a lot of other things that were obstacles. The significance of Woodstock, it was that it was a symbol of social change that was occurring in America during the 60s, and it came at the end of the 60s. It can be argued to have a generation-defining event for people today. It really exemplifies some of the power and the momentum of the underground music. And countercultural movement of that era. By the end of the 60s, though, the hippie movement was pretty much slowing down. Now, the owner of the dairy farm was Max Yasgur, all right? Now, I'm going to play you a little quote from him. He was, again, a dairy farmer, and on Sunday he was asked to mount the stage and address the huge crowd.
Gentlemen, upon whose farm we are, Mr. Max Yasgur. I'm a farmer. I don't know how to speak to 20 people at one time, let alone a crowd like this. But I think you people have proven something to the world. Not only to Pittsburgh or Sullivan County or New York State, you've proven something to the world. This is the largest group of people ever assembled in one place. We had no idea that there would be this size group. And because of that, we had quite a few inconveniences as far as water and food and so forth. Your producers have done a mammoth job. The fields are taken care of. They try to go to bank. But above that, the important thing that you're proving to the world is that 500,000 kids, and I call you kids because I have children older than you are, 500,000 young people can get together and have 3 days of fun and music, and have nothing but fun and music, and I can't specify it.
So that was Max Yasgur delivering kind of a finality to the Woodstock event. In order to squash this counterculture movement, many authorities banned psychedelic drug LSD, which was popularized by Charles Manson. They restricted some political gatherings, and they tried to enforce bans on obscenity in books, theater, music, and other media. So there was, a counter to the counter. The counterculture movement eventually collapsed, and it for 2 reasons. For one, they had achieved a lot of their goals to some degree. Civil rights, civil liberties, some gender equality, or at least discussion of it, the live and let live type of mentality, and the end of the Vietnam War in the mid-1970s. The second reason is many of the counterculture leaders just kind of settled into society, and they became bankers, lawyers, they became plumbers, electricians. They were a cross-section of society. And other counterculture leaders from maybe the 50s passed away, so it just died out quietly. Now, I'm going to, I'm sure everybody, all your listeners there, Mac, have certain songs they might remember from the time. I'm just going to go through 7 or 8 of them. I'm not going to play any of them, but, just give you a little notation. Peter, Paul, and Mary were a folk group, and they performed at the March on Washington in August of 1963. This is where they sang, "If I Had a Hammer," and "Blowing in the Wind." And this was Martin Luther King was at this March on Washington. They played for a pretty huge crowd of 100,000. They're also known for a folk round. It's a type of song that starts and it ends at the same place. And that is, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" So the first stanza is "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" and the last stanza is "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" It's worth something to go back into and look at and look at the words. Barry McGuire wrote and produced a song late 64, 65 called "The Eve of Destruction." It was a very powerful song. He sang it very angrily. Although it didn't have any real connection to Vietnam, this was a little early, it did point out some of the travesties in the world and some of the hypocrisy that was existing. A very powerful song that did not get a lot of play in the 1960s. It was called Requiem for the Masses by the association. It was aimed at the mothers of the young men who were drafted and sent off to Vietnam. This was played on a Sunday variety show called The Smothers Brothers, and it led to the firing of the Smothers Brothers because they had been warned not to have the association perform this song. And when they did have them perform this song, the Smothers Brothers were taken off the air. Again, you didn't hear this a lot on radio stations. Some even say that there was some pressure put on radio stations not to play this, Requiem for the Masses. There's one by Marvin Gaye. It's entitled What's Going On, 1969-70, which he just, asked that question. What's going on? What's going on in this society and everything that is happening? For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield. Another one that has a kind of an eerie sound to it, and it talks about some of the ills of society and the violence, etc. One that the Vietnam veterans really, I've seen this chosen as perhaps their favorite song. I'm sure there's a lot of polls like that, but it was by the Animals, and it's We Gotta Get Out of This Place. And the Vietnam veterans, and many Vietnam veterans, that echoed, their feelings about being in Vietnam. The last one I'll cite is by John Lennon, and this was in the early 70s when he wrote "Give Peace a Chance." And this kind of fit into the counterculture movement. So, in essence, the counterculture movement arose as a reaction to many of the things that were going on in the 1960s, but it became very closely identified with the anti-Vietnam War generation. And again, it left pretty much a lasting impression in so many ways. And it changed the course of society into the 70s and then on. The New Left became a political movement, and it was met in the 80s by Ronald Reagan and the right. So there's a lot of ramifications here that came out of the counterculture movement. So. Okay, Mac, we're going to stop there, and next time we will look at My Lai, one of the atrocities of the Vietnam War that stands out the most, and I am going to highly recommend a film for your viewers to watch, and it is on the internet, so it's accessible. And I'm going to highly recommend it, and I'll talk more about it next session. Okay, thanks, Mac.
Thank you, Dr. Bob, for that enlightening presentation on the counterculture with a very close look at what happened up there at Woodstock. That was a very interesting look at the counterculture. We appreciate it greatly and can't wait to hear your next presentation where you're going to talk about that unseemly event that occurred at My Lai under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, Jr., who today is still a jeweler there in Columbus, Georgia. We're looking forward to it. This is Mack Payne closing out episode 1721 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen. You are cordially invited to come again soon and often and listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
If you like what you hear, then go tell somebody. How about that? Ain't that a mess?